Welcome to the Thrive in the Workplace podcast, brought to you by The Wellness Theory in partnership with B1G1 Business for Good. This podcast is all about uplifting organisations to thrive when it comes to all things workplace wellbeing. From organisational culture, the most effective wellness campaigns you can imagine, and integrating social good. You will find insights, inspiration and information that supports leaders at all levels to implement best practices to improve engagement, performance and vitality within the workforce. We believe that workplaces can and should be healthy and sustainable for both the workforce, the bottom line and the community. And in this podcast, we'll show you how. And just so you know, for every listen this podcast gets, we'll be donating to a life-saving project aligned with the UN 2030 global goals. So thank you for being here and continuing the ripple effect. Without further ado, join us to thrive in the workplace and become a force for good in the world. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Charlotte Stebbing-Mills, and today I'm joined by Jennifer Moss, who is an award-winning writer, international speaker, and workplace culture strategist with clients ranging from startups to Fortune 500 companies. Her most recent book, The Burnout Epidemic, was named in the top 10 best new management books for 2022 by Thinkers 50 and shortlisted for the 2021 Outstanding Works of Literature Award. Jennifer is a nationally syndicated radio columnist and freelance journalist. She writes for the Harvard Business Review, and her work has appeared on CNN, Time, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. So listening close to this episode. So welcome to the show, Jennifer. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I'm so thrilled. I can't wait for our conversation.
Oh, me too. And I have to say, first of all, straight off the bat, a big thank you, because your book, The Burnout Epidemic, which is literally sitting here behind me, has flipped the paradigm that I was living in when it comes to wellbeing in the workplace. And as a result, the role I now play within this space has expanded drastically. We've kind of moved from solely offering these like one-hit wonder, well-intentioned workshops to bring in more of a holistic approach and the core experts and components of wellbeing that are really needed for organizations so that they can create sustainable results. So thank you so much, because it's been pivotal for me in my profession. And I'm sure I'm not the first person saying this to you, surely, but thank you so much.
I'm so thrilled to hear that you're using it in this way, because, and you've read the book, you know that I still think self-care is very important and leaders need to model self-care. And we need to consider that our whole lives aren't going to be only at work, a good portion of it, but there are parts of our life where we should not be thinking about work, and self-care is important, but it isn't really what's going to tackle burnout in a real systemic way. And that means we have to look at it way further upstream. And some of the things that we've been doing, or I think the way we've been tackling it, mostly because we just really, I don't think, truly understand how catastrophic and serious it was, and how baked into corporate hygiene it can be, that we were, dealing with it at that downstream kind of strategy way. And it's good to see, and I love seeing you, leading the charge on that, because a lot of leaders still need help to figure out how to actually effectively prevent burnout.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that idea of, going further upstream to see almost like who's throwing people in the river, because it's absolutely critical to be able to get to the root causes. And that's one of the things I really like about what you've dived into in the book, because you talk about the main causes of burnout. But before we dive into that, for our listeners who might not have actually heard from you, and this might be the first time, can you give us a little bit more about your background and what's led you to write this book in particular?
Yes. And it's a circuitous path, but, sometimes when you look back at your career and you think, oh, actually that made sense, now, but it might not have made sense then. But, it started out with me working in San Jose, and I worked for Robert Half in their communications and did a lot of research around jobs reports and leadership and HR type of, studies and research, working with them. But then, which at the time, I was a journalist. I wasn't thinking that that's necessarily the HR piece, or the behavioral sciences or behavioral economics piece. I didn't necessarily see that was what I was going to focus on. But then this catalyst moment happened in our lives where my husband became very ill and we moved back home to Canada. and started up this company really focused on happiness at work, this idea of positive psychology interventions and how do we really bring that into organizations. Was really important to us. Through that process, as a female co-founder of a tech startup, because that was a big part of it, I burned out, and it made me start to really look at things with a more critical lens, because we had heard so much about toxic positivity. It was, why do so many people feel unhappy, and we can only optimize this certain group that's well? So all of that's working for this really optimized group, but it's not necessarily working if we don't have these institutional stressors being managed. And that led me to burnout, my own experience with it. And then this kind of a really deep awareness after being, as a founder of a company for that long, and entrepreneurs are very at risk of burnout. And so then that kind of led me to write the book. And then the pandemic happened, which was pretty intense. And so I'm writing my next book now. I just handed in the draft. It launches next for Harvard Business Press as well. And it's like a happiness expert, then an happiness expert, and now I'm a reality expert. It's sort of this kind of met between these two pretty far ends of the spectrum.
And that's where the magic is, though, right? And that's where your area of expertise clearly lie. And I also, as much as I don't love what you've been through, because I know how awful that feels, it's also obviously a necessary part of the work that you do today, because that allows you to go so deeply into it and to be able to see it from these unique perspectives, right?
In huge part because the psychological fitness was a big part in why we, why my husband was able to heal through what he went through, and mindset plays a big part because of our own need to be prepared for change and handle change and deal with uncertainty and better cope with the stress that we're under every single day. And yet we also, from the other, side of it, we need to also have policy and programming that makes sense so that we aren't detracting from people's happiness. We aren't leaders that are taking away something that they've been working hard to maintain. So what it is really this sort of ultimate compromise of everyone coming together on both sides to be able to then have a high performing experience of work. And what I've come to realize is you really can't have one without the other. And that's the trick. And when companies do that well, it's fuel, it's magic, like you said. But if you have one doing one thing over here and another doing another thing over here, it doesn't work.
No, exactly. So let's start then with, like, how did we get here? Like, how have we ended up in this crisis of chronic stress and burnout in your eyes?
Well, I mean, I could go back 400 years, really. When you talk to Martin Seligman, he said the moment that we started to get paid for our work and took away the moment that we actually did the work. Like, he uses this analogy, which I love, and I include in the book. He said that moment where you realize you need to fix your roof because it's leaking. And so you go fix your roof and you feel like job well done because it's something that you do for purpose. But then there's a point where you call someone to fix your roof, and that changes, the experience of work. It's just one degree away from the meaning of it. And really when, that is the part that I think has been missing for a long time, is that, and whether that's the right way of thinking of it, or whether for a lot of people, they feel passionate about being a paycheck home to be able to pay for their food and take care of their kids. So whatever anyone's passion is, it's really about this lack of meaning and purpose that we've felt about work for a long time. And I think that is a myriad of reasons, and an evolution of technology just keeping us at work consistently. When you look at the invention of the car phone, for example, and there was so many people that could now work from their cars. There was a disconnect between the office then and home life and work life, and everything just started to jumble together when you could start working from your car. And then it became obviously this rapid evolution of access to people and and really that above and beyond mentality, like, okay, now you have the access. Well, now there's this implicit expectation that if you can work from anywhere, you should work from anywhere. And it ramped up. And then the pandemic reminded us that it was going too far. The pendulum had just swung too far, and people were in a state of just absolute grief and collective trauma. And we were still asking people to work business as usual. And I think that's why we're seeing a bit of a rebellion now.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting the way you've described like the evolution from the car phone to where we are today, just literally immersed in it all of the time. There is no line anymore. The line is gone, well and truly. Like we're way beyond that, aren't we? So in your book, you describe or you touch upon a concept called the exhaustion funnel. I'm curious to know a little bit more about that.
Well, this is based on Dr. Marie Asberg's work out of Stockholm. And what I think is most important about her work is it's the only place, Sweden is the only place where burnout is considered a medical condition. And that's where you start to see pharmacological responses, programming. And I've been watching, what the WHO has done since the definition of burnout in 2019 really made it about institutional and workplace stressors left unmanaged. There's a goal to get it to a place where we can have it in, the DSM and make it actually something that we can treat, diagnose. But Dr. Marie Asberg's work is really based on this extreme exhaustion disorder, right? And you have this timeline of burnout or extreme exhaustion is how she describes it. And you have this sort of timeline, and it's about 18 months or 2 years. She sort of has found, again, some people have longer capacity, some people have shorter capacity, but what she's found is you have these dips, right? You have these moments of burnout, you sort of dip, but then you get back to a set point that's healthy enough. But over time, all of these, consistent dips or pebbles kind of that are you're constantly kind of walking around. And I say it's like walking in pebbles in your shoes until all of a sudden you're carrying a boulder around. And so then there's a point where there is a cliff. And when you hit that cliff, that's catastrophic. And that's where we see 20% of people have PTSD. We see things, we see suicide, we see, self-harm. We see a whole bunch of really dangerous results from that. And what Dr. Marie Asberg said is that it is maybe an 18-month to 2-year timeline of recovery. So that's, I think, interesting too, because what she says is there's a stronger likelihood of you getting burned out again in another career job. And also over your career, you're likely to make less money over the length of your career. So we don't want people to get to the point of kind of no return. And then it's a steep climb.
Yeah.
Out.
That timeline is incredible when you think about that, because it's very common that we're still living in an illusion that just take a holiday and everything will be fine. Just take 2 weeks off, or even 3 months off. It's 6 months off. It's still not usually enough, is it?
No, and why we're seeing people lengthen their mental health disability leaves, because one of the problems with not diagnosing is we then go off on is a related symptom or that happens because we're burned out. Burnout and depression are not the same thing, but there's a strong likelihood that you develop depression or anxiety because of burnout. And so if we had a better way of diagnosing and treating burnout, what we would make sure people did immediately was have a point of disconnection from work, immediately working at, okay, if it's burnout, it's institutional stress. How do we stop that right away? Because a lot of people that then take these leaves are dealing with depression. They're not thinking it's workplace related. They're not getting the rest. So they don't start healing until they really understand that that's what is the problem. That's the root of the problem. So we're just pushing, kicking that can down the road, pushing that real treatment from happening until we diagnose it ourselves, or we have the fortune of listening to this podcast and realizing, okay, that's me. And I think that we need to have better support from mental health professionals, better training for them to be able to help understand what that looks like.
Yeah, definitely. And I think bringing this back really into the workplace as well, it's you can't strategize for solutions until you know a lot of the causes. And in your book you obviously talk about 6 of the causes of burnout in the workplace, which are like workload, perceived lack of control, lack of reward and recognition, poor relationships, lack of fairness, and a values mismatch. So I'm really curious to know that since you've written the book, is there anything new that you would add to those 6? Is there anything else that's come to light that we need to know about?
Well, what's really interesting is those 6 root causes in the definition came out in 2019. And I think this idea of, institutional workplace stress is now blended into a life stress, even though that's what the researchers didn't want to label it as, because we need to find a word for, we need to find a definition for burnout that we can all rally around. It's going to take decades before we all really come to use that in the right way. And because we are using a new word, we're not using a new word. And so that is the problem. We've co-opted a word that has lots of, interpretations around it. And so I think, though, that there is this element of, and this falls under the workload, but there is this element of the technology piece and just even our, the fact that we've had collective trauma, grief that has been, brought into our experience of work. That is where I think we need to be really understanding that there's this other layer because of the pandemic that's novel, and we need to understand that it's really changed us. One of the research that I've been looking into is a threat management theory, this idea of facing your mortality and how it changes the way that you perceive time. And so I've been really looking into how when you have a mortality-based mindset, you are much more likely to change how you value work and think about work and look at it as constantly, your brain's constantly querying, is this worth it? Should I spend my time doing this? My life's shorter, so I need to make sure I cram more things in that are really important to me. And if work is toxic or unhealthy, then you're going to self-select out of it, which we've seen. And I think that from the 6 root causes piece, that, that lack of meaning, I think is a really important part with this new way that we're thinking about our lives and work and how it fits into that context.
Yeah, and we're seeing that play out, aren't we, with the retention in workplaces and the attraction of talent, because, a lot of people are thinking like that way about themselves now, and they're stepping up, I would say, and looking at what's important to them, and they're making decisions. Like, they'd much rather go and work for themselves and take that harder route, some would argue, rather than spend more than a week working for somebody that isn't aligned with who they are. So I really actually loved the fact that you had values mismatch in your kind of big 6, because I think that's something that, from what I've seen anyway, tends to get overlooked the most. I think there's an awareness that, workload and lack of control and these things is there. But I think the values mismatch, so many people are walking around, and I was for a very long time, unaware of what really my own core values were, let alone if they were aligned for the companies I was working for back in the day.
That one is maybe most important now. It was something that was sort of the end of the 6, it was the 6th on the line, and you kind of, it was important. I saw the roles mismatch as being one of the big ones, even pre-pandemic, because of the fact that in the way that we move people up, they become people leaders. And a lot of people don't like to be people leaders. They end up getting out of the work that they love and then just end up sort of being these mini HR managers inside their teams. And so you see a lot of that. But the values piece, because we're so different now, our values are so much closer. One of the cool things our brain does is see death as happening to other people and not to ourselves. That's sort of how we survive without feeling stressed and anxious every single day, that death is just around the corner. But this, that's what we used to think. But when you have this sort of renewed sense of purpose in your life, or meaning, or desire to have legacy, that's how people think differently about work. They're thinking more about, is this where I want to leave my legacy? Is this something that I'm proud of? Do I feel connected to the mission because that's now a core value to me? And you're right. You're seeing a lot of high profile executive women and in government. I mean, with Jacinda Ardern and others that have left to just say there's no fuel in the tank. And a lot of that narrowing of the executive pipeline is just more women saying, for female talent, but more women just saying, like, this is not worth it. I don't want to sacrifice all these other things. I can still have a great job and make money and do well and have the balance. And I don't need to have all those other things. And so that is a big loss that we're seeing. We're also seeing men working less. They went from an average of 65 hours to 55 hours, which is, they were working a lot, which is disturbing how much they were working, but they reduced their hours significantly. And that's a big shock too. We're seeing that play out in GDP. So it's everyone going through this right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned the number of hours worked. There was something in your book, I can't remember the exact number. Maybe it was 55 hours, that after 55 hours, like, it's pointless anyway, sticking around because you're not doing anything.
There's a point at 55 hours where it starts to be really dangerous for your health and your long-term health. They look at even lifespan as being impacted, but it's also just, there's no sense of doing it. If you could be working 55 hours and you get just as much done as you would in what they found around 40. So you've just wasted 15 extra hours for no reason, but it's because you're not using your time efficiently. And so the more efficiency you can get, which is why the 32-hour work week continues to demonstrate that there's success there, is that we become much more careful about how we spend our time. And we don't have the same meeting fatigue. We don't have the same, inefficiencies in process. All of that kind of stuff gets really, highly scrutinized in those environments. And then you don't waste time and you can have 32 hours that you work a week instead of 60, which is incredibly healthy for people.
Yeah, 32 hours is much more palatable. And it's something that, like you said, is managing time, but I think also managing your energy wisely as well, so that you can show up and give your best in that 32 hours, right? Otherwise, again, we're just like on the hamster wheel, doing it for doing its sake, and that doesn't get anyone anywhere.
No, we increased our meetings just in Teams alone by 252%. That's just astronomical. I mean, why do we have to have that many Teams meetings? We have our Zoom meetings, they increased by 2,900%. I mean, we just have seen so much increase in meetings. And Shopify did this really cool case study where they purged all their meetings for a couple of months just to see what would happen. And they kept a few. You were allowed to keep a few on the calendar, but really just made it so that it was bare bones. They saved 322,000 hours. So they said it was the equivalent, and this was just in a few months, but it was the equivalent of hiring 150 people. I mean, just the idea of getting that amount of time back, which demonstrates that it's just so inefficient. And a lot of people have, because it was like they went cold turkey on the meetings, they didn't bring a lot of those back. They realized, oh, I didn't really need to have that much inefficiency in my life. And I think that we're over looping, we're over collaborating, we're taking advantage of people's time, we're not being as respectful of people's time. And I think that is playing a big role in people's burnout.
And there's a lot of companies now, I say a lot, I think we're starting to see it emerge, at least here in this region, that we're becoming a bit more outcome focused than time focused. I think that's adding a lot of value to the employees, is because they're then able to actually just focus on what needs to be done without these unnecessary restrictions or just like lack of thought about the structure of the workplace.
Goals, not hours, is such a better way of measuring success. Someone wants to get it done quicker. Someone has more productivity at 2 versus at 9 in the morning. I sort of hit my stride at a certain time in the morning, and other people are ready to go at 6 and they want to be productive then. And I think the idea that we're creating this cookie cutter expectation of people that are totally different. There was this one study for nurses, and they found that nurses in the morning had a harder time to get care, but they had it much easier in the evening to get a babysitter. And so there was all these morale issues and stressors, and it was just tweaking, start when school starts for this group of nurses that required it. And there was others that wanted to get home, early or didn't care. And so it's having conversations around the freedom to be able to choose when you work, because it could totally change your experience of going into work if you're not dealing with constant stress of juggling what's happening in the other part of your life. And so I think that's why we need to get better at not having these fixed ideas of what work should look like and what time we should be working. Instead, we should be looking at the goals of the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I'm in a hospital and I've got a nurse that I need their expertise in, I don't want them worried about whether their kids are being looked after and whether the babysitter's there or not. I want them focused on whatever it is they're supposed to be doing at work, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there's so much research that's been done on burned out physicians and nurses and malpractice suits and errors, medical errors, misdiagnoses. You have less fatigued, more well healthcare professionals, you're going to have better care. And so, I mean, when we really think about this potential life or death risk that we're taking, we have to go all the way down to the root and say, okay, we can't have this many nurses working overtime. We can't have these kinds of ridiculous shifts where nurses are doing doubles and doctors are awake for 24 hours, because it could be the difference of someone living or dying. And we're not attaching those enough. Even though there's tons of research to show it, it seems like we can't really fix, healthcare stressors.
Which is ironic that in your book, you reveal that that's one of the most vulnerable groups among us, or one of the most vulnerable industries. Like that's so ironic to me. Like it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
There's some really great administrations and consortiums that are doing awesome work, and I share some of that in the book, but I'm even seeing the real issue with the administration load, the electronic healthcare records. They're doing a lot of work. I say a lot of, there's certain groups that are doing a great job with it. There's this one hospital I thought was great, this group of hospitals where they had every single time someone would have a horrible experience with their record keeping tools, they were able to send a note to the portal, and it was like the stupidest thing that happened with my EHR today. And it was, people would win awards and be like touted for their stupidest moment with their technology. And what they found is it saved just them knowing these tiny little shifts. They would hand it over to their technology partner and saying, this little tweak, like why can't my people work with it? And they started to improve it based on all this feedback, and they saved 5,000 nursing hours in 1 year. And so, we have lots of ways of tackling these things, and everyone thinks it's a big lift. And, nurses and doctors are afraid if they leave their shift, then that means that someone's going to die. And that's a very horrible thing to have to feel as someone who's a caregiver and in a caregiver profession. But there's other things that leaders can be doing behind the scenes to just take tiny pressures off. Yeah. And that's what we need to be considering, are the tiny pressures that just give people incremental time back. And then obviously people have a healthier outcome in their experience of healthcare.
Yeah, and stress stacks up, right? So yes, it saves the time, but also those little frustrations, they will get the better of you eventually. What is also ironic is that in that example is that one of the other groups that you spoke about that is vulnerable are the tech guys, right? So now we've got nurses giving it over to the tech guys, but the tech guys are also vulnerable. But I find it really interesting that we're seeing these patterns within different industries, but there's also patterns in personalities, right? There's more personality types that are at risk. Perhaps share some of those for us.
Yes, and healthcare is one that does attract this personality trait, which is perfectionism. Perfectionism is something that we see. Actually, I see this a lot in high production environments, consulting, legal professionals, or in law. Anywhere where you've worked really hard and had to battle, I think, in all the way since you were a young person to get into that school, to then be able to get your MBA or your law degree or become a physician, or, where a lot of it is status. And a lot of it is also around just being the best of the best. Then those people that are already, like type A and could be perfectionist, they had perfectionist strivings, it moves to perfectionist concerns. And then you have the real potential risk of burnout, because there's a lot of all or nothing thinking. You make a mistake and that means you shouldn't be a doctor. You're terrible at your job. You lose a case if you're a lawyer, and that means you shouldn't be a lawyer. You're never meant to ever do this job. And so those types of professions draw perfectionists, because you sort of, have that mentality already. You're very driven. And then it just churns out this environment that is way more hours than it should be, known for overwork, known for high level of detail, kind of no mistakes can be made because there's such dire consequences. I mean, then you also have the sandwiching for healthcare. It's the patient, obviously, and then people that are leading, but also in law or consulting, you have the client, and then so you have external and internal stakeholders, and all of that just is a recipe for really high levels of burnout within those professions. And teachers tend to be a bit type A too. You see in education, they have perfectionist strivings and concerns there too. And so they are also at high risk. And that's that personality type that's drawn to these professions, and those professions then leverage that.
Oh, there's so many ways that I can go with what I want to ask you next, but let's go this way. So in your book, there are so many strategies that you share for the causes of burnout and how to look at starting to overcome them, from the personality types. There's so much in there. So anybody's listening to this, if you haven't read it, make sure you read the book, The Burnout Epidemic, which is literally behind me. So you'll be able to see it. You'll be able to find it anywhere and everywhere. We'll make sure the link is in this episode as well. But strategies. I'm not going to ask you for all of your strategies, of course, but what are some of like the absolute game changers that perhaps you've learned or seen that have had the biggest kind of bang for their buck when companies have really taken this on board?
I find that organizations that have this mindset of huge empowerment for their direct managers, where they are leading from the top. So you see leaders modeling self-care. They're taking their time off. They're making sure that they have really good right to disconnect policies, that they have a high level of empathy. Any leader that demonstrates that they kind of get what's going on, and they're vulnerable and humble, and they're asking a lot of questions. They're doing a lot of data gathering, but not just looking back surveys, like in the moment, looking at what's in, for example, I share this with the Hewlett Packard, like looking in some of the, chats in the ERGs and stepping into meetings of ERGs, CEOs going into the women in leadership, actual employee resource groups and participating. I say leaders need to be joiners. So when leaders are joining, you working really. But then there's also this direct manager piece, because direct managers play a huge role in your happiness or your unhappiness at work. And so they're empowered, and it's a contagion effect across an organization where that is the way that leaders are expected to behave, because sometimes you can see a real discrepancy between one manager and another. And so there needs to be a real policy and reward system for managers that are tracking things like burnout and well-being. And there's metrics around having a kind of a healthy team. And so again, it's these incremental pieces. And then that direct manager who understands that this is an important part of their role is trialing and iterating and being very agile. I keep hearing people like, oh yeah, like the pandemic's behind us and let's go back to normal, or this new normal that everyone's saying. And it's like, we haven't really learned anything. This is still very fresh. And we had a complete disruption, a global disruption. This isn't just like, Uber. This is like metaverse shifting kind of situation, paradigm shifting environment at work. So we don't know anything and we have to learn. And going kind of back to old ways is not going to actually be, really succeed. It won't be the way that we get people to stay motivated. And so what we're seeing with managers is, okay, I'm going to test something like I'm going to reduce meetings this week, something really simple and incremental. And I'm going to ask, how you feel at the beginning, job satisfaction, well-being, all that kind of the basic stuff, 3 or 4 questions, and then try it for 8 weeks. And then they see, did that help? And people will say yes, because one of those things that really does help is being able to reduce your meeting fatigue. But there's other things we can do. It's kind of like what I say is having this really sort of infrastructure in your meetings where you have a non-work related check-in every single week. You're asking things like, what's lit you up this week? What stressed you out? And then everyone around the team will say, what can we do to make next week easier for each other? And this 3-question strategy that's consistent, you never miss it. It's every single week. At 6 months, you're still going to have this meeting every week. So then people become more vulnerable. We develop more psychological safety. There's more sharing. Leaders are joiners, so they're sharing. We find that this constant structure of testing, learning, helping, supporting each other, being aware of other people's stressors creates a really healthy relational cadence. You kind of start to jive with each other because what is working, what isn't. We see a lot of burnout prevention there. We see a lot of healthy conversations. The psychological safety is up and job satisfaction is up, and we lose a lot less people. So there's less churn, which also helps too. So again, it's like all these pieces and organizations really looking at it top level, but then how do we work on this as an effort every day? And I think that's what like I said, it's a lifestyle change, not a diet. So it's very long-term thinking, but short-term wins every single day.
And the old ways of thinking are just not going to cut it anymore, right? We have to adopt what you're sharing, because it's the only way that it's going to change, right? I had a little back and forth with a colleague earlier today, actually, and it was of a similar kind of nature around the non-work related check-ins. And what she said to me was, when did it become our responsibility to look after people personally? And I was like, whoa, hang on a minute, like, how on earth are you supposed to progress with a person, a human being, if we're not taking their humanness into account? Like, what do you say to somebody that's taking that stance?
Well, the minute that you stop asking them to work while they're at home, then that's when you get the right to not care about them as a person. I mean, unless there's absolutely no intersection for that role where they're not bringing any of that home. And also when we make it so stress-free that people aren't taking the stressors that they deal with at work home with them. So we have an obligation to make sure that there isn't a trickle over effect in people's personal lives. And so if we are going to, the point that changed was when we, when we weren't in the 50s and you went to work and started your shift at the bank and you locked the bank up at 5 o'clock and you went home and you weren't working on Sundays and, you didn't have weekends open. I mean, when we started to spill like work into every single corner of our lives, that's when work and leadership and organizations started to consider the possibility that they had a role to play in someone's happiness and healthiness.
Yeah, I think you can't be blind to somebody as a person. Like, it's impossible, like in this day and age.
No.
we're not machines, we're not robots. Like it's just impossible. Like, of course you're going to bring personal to work and work home with you to some extent, even even energetically, even if you're not bringing home the actual tasks, your mind is still playing a part somewhere in there, and your emotions. So I think a lot of what's got us into this mess is perhaps that we haven't had that awareness of that change that you've just described. So we haven't brought the person element into the workplace, right? Which is where human-centered leadership comes in.
Absolutely. And I love what you're saying, because there is no bifurcation in the brain where there's this one part of the brain that just, it tucks all the work in there. And then there's no, it doesn't talk to the rest of the brain. I mean, that would be like that TV show on Apple where basically you get, kind of, you go into work. It's a great show actually. And it's really interesting you say that, because basically they get switched off. They go in there, they have a little implant in their brain and they go down into their work and it gets switched off. So they know nothing about their home life. And then they only know their work life between both places.
That really actually freaked me out watching that as well, because I was like, this is what a lot of companies want to some extent. It's just,
that's that's the thing. Maybe when someone asks us that, we should just send them, to a link to watch that show, because we just can't do that. Our brains don't do that. And, there's a lot of argument of whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we have to recognize that people, are a whole person, and organizations that really do look at that, at the whole person, the 24-hour kind of cycle of a person's experience of their life, they do really well when it comes to prevention, and optimization. So they're the ones that are also reaping the benefits of a much more healthy organization. And the thing is we think, oh, just transactionally, right? Okay, so why do I have to care about that person? But, well, do you want to hit goals? Do you want to exceed revenue expectations? Do you want to deliver more shareholder value? Do you want more productivity and engagement? I mean, that's what happens when we take care of people. They have this amazing rocket fuel. And so we want a whole bunch of people in our organizations with rocket fuel, because it just makes us all do better. And we look at this in a deficit mindset a lot, like, oh, like I have to think about mental illness and I have to make sure that I'm there for people in crisis and stuff. And I'm thinking, you have to understand that that's the continuum, but there's a point where we get people to a place of optimization, and that's what we're looking for. It's not a deficit mindset. It's a abundant mindset of what we can have when we do create this energy inside of our organizations.
I don't think we're really looking at well-being on a continuum, really. I think it's almost like problem, let's try to fix it, and that's it. Is this start and finish point, and actually this work will never be done. It's ongoing, right? One of the things that you talk about, or what you mentioned in the book, I think it was something like it takes tons of small little moments to be able to really create change.
It is a network effect, and I love Christakis and Fowler's work on social contagions, when the Framingham Heart study, and they found that heart health is contagious, which was really interesting, but it was mostly you just see other people taking care of themselves. And so it creates a social contagion. Well, happiness is a social contagion, but also loneliness and depression and burnout. And so, when we create network effects, we do it in just little ways that demonstrate quick wins. And that's part of that is the habit stacking. I mean, just seeing quick wins and giving us that, that those healthy chemicals that make us feel like this is the right choices we're making. We should keep doing it because it makes us feel good. But it is also just other people seeing that this team is flourishing and they're doing a really good job. And what are they doing that is making such a difference? And why are they always hitting those goals or exceeding those goals or recognized? Well, that is what happens bit by bit, because it takes time to build kind of the hygiene, the habit of well-being in our organizations. Then it catches on. And the more people then start to pick that up, or it becomes the undertone of the organization. research I was looking at just recently is around positive gossip and negative gossip. And, when you have positive gossip, even just speaking about people to other people in a really positive way, you have other people that assume that people are talking about you kindly, and you start to feel more open and connected. And then it shows this, like, this energy increases, and you're more likely to come up with, constructive ideas. You're more innovative. And so it's like the tone, the contagion effect of healthy, positive environment completely triggers these really neat kind of domino effects across an organization in a very positive way.
Yeah. And that's so powerful for anybody listening, is that, yes, that transformation is a journey, right? It's not something that just happens overnight. Like you said earlier, it's a lifestyle, not a diet. And I think that almost sums it up to some extent, if we were really going to simplify it. There's one more thing I'd like to touch upon that you talk about in your book, which is around good intentions gone bad, because I think this is a very prominent undertone to what we're seeing in the workplaces. And there are so many workplaces that are really trying, and I absolutely love them for that. However, sometimes it backfires. So can you perhaps share a little bit more, and maybe some of your most extreme examples of good intentions gone bad?
Oh gosh, there's so many, that I had, interviewed in conversations, of so many stories that came out of that were pretty distressing. I mean, you see, one of the examples that I share in the book was just, those steps challenges, and everyone wants to get fit, and the fitness is really important. But then there was a gentleman that sent a note to me saying, I am in a wheelchair, and having everyone running stairs or having a Fitbit test just makes me feel so excluded. And this is just a micro example that shares a bigger story, and that this is a good thing. We want to think about physical fitness, but we have to think about everyone having an interpretation of what that looks like for them. And that, if you extrapolate that across a major problem that we're seeing right now, is this work remote, work hybrid, full-time, in-person argument that everyone's having. And a lot of it is this idea that productivity or an engagement and workplace culture happens in an office when we see each other. And I'm sure we can remember back to 2019, and there was still people in offices that were having a miserable time. So this idea that, that is the solution to a culture problem is very frustrating to me, because it's understanding that there's certain people that work well in different environments. And then, and see that when we create a one size fits all for everyone without having really good awareness of what's going on at the root of why maybe someone doesn't want to come in, or why someone really needs to come in, it's looking at the nuances. I mean, when you look at women, for example, they have disproportionate expectations on them to juggle family life, and you want them to be in the office, and yet we've created this paradigm for them that they don't have the same luxury. Well, then why aren't we thinking about, if you want people back in the office, having childcare support, dealing with those problems that are at root of the institutional stress? When you think about the fact that we went from 4% to 38% of people saying they have social anxiety through the pandemic. We were told to avoid people like Pac-Man in grocery stores. We weren't supposed to be near them. And now we're saying, well, everyone's back, not recognizing that maybe we need to have a process that's slower and have communication around what makes this place safe. How do I create environments in my office space for people that are introverted or socially anxious that they can go to? So these intentions of just, okay, we got to get everyone to be together because that's going to solve this culture problem or disengagement or lack of productivity. It's no, we've changed. Our intentions have to have nuances to them. And again, a lot of that boils down to asking, just asking people, finding out what's happening with them. How are they feeling? And then not looking at that as a chore, or I shouldn't have to because I'm lost. It's what you want to optimize your workplace. Don't you want to do better? Like, don't you want to be best in class? Well, then that's what you do to be best in class.
And just be a good human, right? You can be the best in class, but just be a good person, right? And I think like one of the takeaways from what you've just said there for me is the relevance and matching the intention with the outcome. Because at the moment, what we're seeing is we like the shiny stuff, we like the steps challenges, we like to be seen to be doing something. I want to share my team's laughter therapy session on LinkedIn and the photos that go with this. Like, okay, but that's no good for all the examples you've just described, and making somebody probably stay longer in it, or put more pressure on their workload to get it done in less time, because now they've got to show up and spend an hour in this laughter thing. Where's the last thing they want to be doing?
Because we need to deal, with the root causes of their stress. Like they're really dealing with depression. I mean, it's really difficult to put yourself in a situation where you're out there because you're dealing with a lot of insecurity and anxiety and self loathing. I mean, there's just such a horrible thing that happens to us when we get depressed. All the things that we love to do don't give us joy anymore. So we need to deal with that. And I think another thing that I keep seeing are these headlines around, oh, this, we gave our whole burned out staff a week off. And I mean, it's just such, it's like wellness washing. We're saying we're doing this week off for our, like, do you hear yourself, for our burned out staff? Yeah, they're burned out because of workload that they're probably going to go back to. This vacation, they call it vacation debt, right? This time off tax can be extraordinary. It can be like 30 hours on each end to take time off for people if we don't have strategies to make sure that they can have time off effectively. And when you just go back, it's maybe a day or two that you're going to feel the benefits of that. You go back and you're burned out again because nothing's changed. So even just well-being days are intended, but we need to stop having people take wellness days when they're at their max. We need to have people taking wellness days preventatively, to be able to have them every so often to catch up. Taking, one every 2 weeks is going to stop someone from having to take mental health disability leave. And we don't do that. We being days or wellness days when we're sick. And by that time, it could be too late. So all of these things are really just thinking upstream and, like you said, being a human. But unfortunately, not every leader thinks like that, thinks like, I want to be a human. They're looking at the bottom line. And so we have to say, okay, if you aren't thinking that you want to do this as a human-centered leader, which I hope more people become, think of it as a bottom line issue, because there's a lot of reason to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so many numbers that support that. And we've had an episode with Scott Armstrong who demonstrated that really, really well. So anybody listening that's curious to know about the ROI on well-being, tune into that episode. Jennifer, I could sit and speak to you about this all day long. I'm very aware that we're not going to do that today. But what I do want to ask you is, if you had perhaps like a minute and every leader was suddenly conscious and receptive to everything that you have to say, what would you ask them, or what would you say to them?
I would tell leaders and ask leaders to throw away this idea that we can still keep chugging along the way that we have been, and to say that it's really going to be difficult for you. And I have lots of empathy, because we tend to see leaders in a certain, age group and demographic. And I'm at 47, I'm an Xer. I was raised the same way that they were. You go in the office, put your nose down, and then you get your big retirement package or whatever that looks like for Xers and boomers. But please look at this as a radical shift. And we can't keep digging in. The sooner we stop digging in and the more receptive and open we are, even to the fact that we're going to have 30% of the workforce in the next 5 years made up of Gen Zs, we won't have any option to not radically change. And unless we just let all of that expectation go, or we thought it was going to be, or what we want it to be, it's time to just say, okay, radical acceptance. This is different. How do I lead in this new moment, so that I can be that leader that does demonstrate that I get it, and people will want to rally around that. And I think that is what we need to do right now, is just let it go. It's not 2019, it's 2023, and it's a whole world of work.
I love it. The time is now, for sure. The time is definitely now. Jennifer, what is next for you? So first of all, anybody that hasn't read your book, again, I'm going to reiterate, go and read the book. But what's next for you? Because you've alluded, I think, to another book that's coming as well.
I just handed in the draft for my next book for Harvard Business Press, and it's launching next September. And it really is these 5 key strategies to working and leading today, and looking at it from a complete novel approach. It's sort of upending the way we think about everything from belonging to meaning to our relationship with technology and AI and purpose. And I have a chapter really that's focused on women, why work isn't for women, and why it's so unfriendly, and how we can, change that. And DEIA, why is it failing? Why haven't we really figured out what to do there? So taking some of these really big issues that were boiling point issues pre-pandemic, but that have totally flipped its head in the last few years, and provide some really novel approaches. And, I've had the privilege of talking to some amazing, academics. I spoke with Claudia Golden just a couple weeks ago, who just won the Nobel Prize for her her work looking at women in from history. Looked at, spoke with John Clifton, CEO of Gallup, and really dug into friendships at work and our friendship recession. And, spoke to lots of really interesting people from around the world, just everyday employees, and what they're experiencing when they see empathy in action, when they see support for them as a Black woman of color, or a woman of color. What does that look like for me in this environment? And how do I get allyship? And how do you be a better leader? So I'm really excited about that part, because I think it's the stories of everyday people and where they're seeing it work and where they're seeing it failing that I think we can all really learn from.
Wow. Well, I'll be at the front of the line for that book coming out. I mean, you see, like when Apple launched something, the big queues of everybody asleep outside the Apple store. That's what I'm like for this kind of work.
I love that.
So I'll go and sleep outside the bookstore for that one.
Oh, that makes me so happy. You'll be the one person, which I will love.
Well, hopefully after this episode that won't be the case, so let's see. But Jennifer, thank you so much for your time coming on the show today. As you know, for every listener this podcast gets, a donation is being made towards one of the 2030 sustainable goals, and you have chosen to support the global goal 3 of good health and well-being. So finally, my last question to you is, why is this goal so important for you?
It's important to me because when you look at that goal, you see the impacts of not paying attention. I mean, we really look at it from in the UN, and I was part of the Global Happiness Council, and we really looked at what are the deficits when we don't have wellness and we don't have mental health. And I know in the last few years, it's been even a bigger need for us, especially with youth mental health. And so that matters to me. But I also see that the happiest countries, are the most thriving. And that is because they are focused on prevention, and they are also focused on helping people to feel like they can have psychological safety inside of their countries, inside of their communities. And I want to give that to everyone. I want everyone to feel safe and loved and cared for, because it's a really wonderful feeling to have that kind of level of safety. And on the flip side, it's catastrophic if we don't have it.
Well said. Well said. Jennifer, thank you so much again for your time and coming on today and sharing your insights and your wisdom. There's so much that we still have to learn from you, I have no doubt. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Oh, this was wonderful. Great questions and great conversation. I was just so glad we could do this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Today's episode was hosted by myself, Charlotte Stebbing-Mills, the co-founder of The Wellness Theory. If you enjoyed this episode, please do subscribe and share with someone who may benefit and be part of our mission to help people realise when they're healthy and well, they can be a force for good in the world. I just wanted to share some more about our partner, B1G1. B1G1 is a global movement that enables businesses to incorporate effective impact creation into their everyday activities in a simple and powerful way. Through B1G1, businesses can choose from a wide range of verified projects around the world and integrate these impacts into their business operations. The core concept of B1G1 is that every business transaction or interaction can be directly linked to making a positive impact in our world, whether it's providing access to clean water, supporting education, planting trees, or addressing social issues. B1G1 enables businesses of all types to make a real difference. To find out more about them, visit their website at b1g1.com. Until next time, be well, mean well, and make a difference that lasts. See you in the next episode.